So welcome everyone as people continue to filter in. Welcome to this free webinar, Focus on Councils and supporting them with their emissions reduction plans and activities. We're really going to focus on the plan today. It's going to be a 90-minute long piece. We're going to move through it really quickly today. It's really an overview, but if you miss anything, there will be a recording and that session will be provided to you over the next couple of days. There'll also be some resources that we will provide you, which will support you with your ongoing work. Your mics and cameras have been switched off just to help with bandwidth, but we would like Q&A from yourself, questions. If you pop those into the Q&A box or the chat, we will catch them at pause points throughout. We would like to start with I'll start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where we each meet from today. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and their continued connection to this land. Let us also acknowledge the many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have contributed to the rich cultural heritage of our nation. I'd like to introduce you to myself and to Claudia, who you'll see on camera there. I've been in the automotive game for as long as I can remember, and about 8 years as an EV specialist. I've been involved in a dozen council transition plans and other transition plans, which brings my tally to about 10,000 vehicles. Up until recently, I was building electric refrigerated trucks for a company to help move food around, and I'm really driven these days with my own consultancies, EV Integrations. You'll see the branding around the place to support fleet's transition. And then, yeah, introducing you to Claudia, who's on the line there as well.
Hi, everyone. It's great to have you here today. I'm a chemical engineer originally, and I've spent about 30 years working in engineering, safety and sustainability. And I started my working career in a waste management company where I dealt a lot with trucks, and then moved to consulting engineering where I advised, in particular, quite a lot of governments, state, federal and local. Then I moved across to council where I ran the corporate sustainability team for Inner West Council, and while I was there we developed up a fleet transition plan with Nathan's help and then started implementing it. So I guess I'm here to provide a little bit of council flavour to the meeting, and yeah, I really look forward to chatting with you all about it.
Thanks, Claudia. And so just give you a bit of an insight as to what we're going to run through today, a little bit of background around and progress in the EV space, and specifically focused for councils. And then we're really going to delve into the planning process, help you with your plans. Now, I'm expecting some to be on their journey already or maybe early on. And so we're going to give you some hints and tips and some insights that might help you to work through that in a smoother way. As I mentioned before, love to have your questions. There'll be a couple of pause points through the presentation to provide to get your questions answered from myself and Claudia, and yeah, a few little surprises along the way as well. So without too much further ado, we shall kick off.
Thanks, Nathan. I'll take this one. I realised I should have explained before as well that I now have my own small consulting business advising on sustainability. So I'm no longer in the council world officially, but I'm actually working more or less solely with councils at the moment, which is great. So before we kick off with a bit more detail, we just wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page with vehicle fuel types. You know, due to the wonderful human ingenuity, we've got a few different types of fuels now for our vehicles. The traditional ICE, internal combustion engine, which of course is petrol, diesel, so on. We've got hybrid vehicles, which is your internal combustion engine plus a battery that stores braking energy. It doesn't have a plug. The next type is the plug-in hybrid, where we've got the internal combustion engine, but we also have a battery and you plug in to charge it, often called the PHEV. And then what I think Nathan and I think of as zero emissions vehicles, which is your full battery electric vehicle and your hydrogen powered electric vehicle. The technology for the hydrogen is a little less advanced. So I think what we're talking about today mainly is probably mostly the battery powered vehicles. If there's any questions about any of that sort of EV 101, then as mentioned before, Nathan has prepared a great resources pack. Just shoot a message through or a question into the chat line and we'll either address it today or we'll put it into the resources pack. From a council's point of view, I guess there's two drivers for transitioning to electric vehicles from the ICE fleet. And the first driver is the climate commitments that many councils have made. Certainly at the federal and state government level, they've made commitments to be net zero by 2050 universally, although the ACT is a bit earlier. And local government also has similar climate commitments. In fact, they're often more ambitious. I think it's partly because we have a lot more control over our own fleet and our own assets. So a number of councils have got a net zero target of 2040, some by 2035, some by 2030, and some, like in West, 2025. So there's definitely a strong driver there to look at how we reduce carbon. And by the way, when I say carbon, of course, I'm using that as shorthand for all the gases that have an impact on climate change. Thanks, Nathan. Oh, interesting. Okay. This is all driven by mostly council resolutions. So most councils have now passed some kind of climate management resolution, and most of them actually also have climate action plans. And then there's also a range of other public statements of commitment that many councils have made. For example, there's over 180 that are committed to the Cities Power Partnership, and that's a organisation that's all about being carbon neutral, climate management, net zero. About 19% of councils have declared a climate emergency, which is a particularly strong statement, and it's particularly those who have a lot of push from their electorates. So on the next page, you'll see that councils have obviously not just made these resolutions, but they've had to think about how they're going to meet them. So most councils have a climate management plan of some type. And the first step in preparing that is figuring out where your emissions are actually coming from. So what you can see here is the emissions by sector within a council. So there's typical urban council and a typical regional council. And you can see for a typical urban council, about 70% is from their electricity supply, so street lights and the electricity that you use in your assets. And in regional councils, that's skewed a bit because often they're running water and sewerage infrastructure. So sewage and electricity is an important component of theirs. But councils have not only prepared plans, they've mostly started implementing them. And that has changed the way the pie looks, as you can see there on the screen. So a lot of councils have already gone to quite a lot of work and trouble to source renewable electricity through, they're often called PPAs. And as a result, the electricity supply is now net zero. And what that means is, I guess, the councils are looking at the next cab off the rank. And in urban councils, that's going to be fleet, so looking at the fuel emissions. And in regional councils, it's the sewage and water systems and then the fleet. But the sewage and water systems are quite a big infrastructure activity. So in fact, fleet is easier to transition. In other words, the next thing that councils are likely to do to manage their emissions is to look at the fleet. And that is definitely happening already in some. If we look at the next slide, Nathan. Just a little fact for the sustainability folks on the line, just to make them aware that the carbon intensity of diesel has changed in the greenhouse emission factors. And what that means, of course, is that the portion of your pie that is fuel is about to expand quite a bit, which is going to make the focus on that even stronger. The second driver is around the technology change, and the benefits that you see from EVs. And here's some of the benefits here on the screen. Those that are particularly interesting to councils, I think, are the fact that they're quieter. And those of us who have residents who complain about parks vehicles or garbage trucks will completely understand that, managing that noise is important. Air pollution is a surprising one. There's actually more Australians that die from complications of air pollution than there are of Australians who die from vehicle accidents. So it is an important issue, and some electorates are very aware of it. Some of our residents, certainly at Inner West, we got some pressure on that topic. Of course, carbon emissions we've already discussed, and EVs are more efficient as well. So they the engines use a higher proportion of the power from the battery compared to an ICE vehicle, which uses less of the power from the fuel. I might flick, yeah. So we definitely are seeing the light electric vehicles beginning to take hold. In fact, you can see that of the Q2 2024 new car sales, about a quarter of it is actually some type of electric vehicle. And of course, it's higher overseas. So in China, I think it's around 50% of the new cars have a plug. And you'll see a similar sort of scenario over in Europe. And in fact, that creates a bit of a challenge for us in Australia. We tend to be early adopters of technology, but here we find that there's quite a lot of strong competition from other markets, and that's meant that it's been a little slower for EVs to come here, but that's definitely changing, as we can see here. And here's some examples of light EVs in action in actual council fleets. Nathan, do you want to talk to any of them, or shall I?
Yeah, look, I think there's great examples, and for many years now, that several councils who have gone early, particularly in vehicles that are quite, viewable or visible to constituents and so on. And it has also been an early experiment, and I guess you've experienced that at Inner West in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, yes. Um, and then if you have a look at heavy vehicles, they're slightly more challenging, but they're definitely starting to take off. As you can see there, it's a small proportion, but the trend is definitely starting. And in fact, if we go to the next section, you'll see that most of those heavy vehicle EVs are in a couple of fleets, namely Woolies and Team Global Express. And that is great for councils, because what that means is that those organisations, which are big, robust organisations, are essentially trialling truck EVs for us. So that's fantastic. It means that we've got a lot of knowledge now in Australia and a lot of examples of trucks that work well and charging that works well and so on. So I think councils tend to like to be the second uptake of new technology, and I think we're seeing that happening now. Next one. And here you can see some of the examples of those fleets that were showing up on that pie chart before. And Nathan, you've been involved directly in some of these, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a few in here that have been running some time. That VB truck in the middle there for Linfox, it's been running about 2.5 to 3 years. It's been going a long time. The Woolies fleet, the vehicle just below that, excuse me, VB truck is one of about 110 now that are operating across several sites on the East Coast. And then, various vehicles, the vehicle with the KFC sign there, that's something I have been intimately involved in. And you can see some of the couple of other vehicles there. So you've got some garbage trucks starting to pop up, and clearly up in the top left-hand corner, an example of a photon there, which is a parks and gardens style arrangement. So with towing a mower and so on, and we're starting to see those kinds of applications become available, tippers, and then even concrete. So lots of different applications, lots of different models.
And the interesting thing about preparing a transition plan is that you're obviously often looking over a fairly long time frame. You might focus in on a couple of segments of your fleet, but it's important to start at least thinking about it now because we've got some ambitious climate commitments, and we don't really want to be baking in the tailpipe emissions because when we're looking at heavy vehicles and trucks, they're typically around for 6 to 10 years. So if you buy a diesel truck today, you're stuck with it. You have to find another way of offsetting those emissions. So having a plan and starting to think about it now and starting to think about charging, etc., is really helpful. But at least that's what we found in Inner West.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so what we wanted to do is really put the bulk of our time today, after sort of setting out those reasons why the landscape may be changing, is really helping to provide you with some tips on planning for the transition. As I said, I expect several councils to be at different points in this journey, and so maybe some of these things are in the rearview mirror, and some of these things are ahead of you. But hopefully, there's some value there. And I think one of the things that sort of thinking about this program was what percentage of fleets have a plan today? I've worked on about a dozen. I estimate probably somewhere in the order of about a third of councils have an active fleet transition plan they're working on, which means that there's quite a few that have still got work to do. So we thought this was why this series was going to be quite useful. And so we're sort of thinking about the stages of a plan, or the stages of transition that head towards a plan. And really, we see it as sort of four major activity phases, if you like, really starting with an agreement in principle. You can't get going unless somebody says get going. We've seen, and we see that the sort of drivers for those agreements in principle are some sort of resolution,
Yeah.
plans coming out of the broader climate plan, targets and goals that are set that really mean there is a catalyst for some activity and going on from there.
Yeah, that's certainly what we used, that I used anyway, is the fact that we had a overarching climate plan, which touched briefly on electric vehicles but didn't go into lots of detail, and we had a council resolution to meet a carbon target by a particular date.
Yeah, really important.
Mm.
And then after that was really setting up the working group, and the control group specifically, stakeholders from across council to set the framework and intentions, to set the ground rules, to set the general approach to working on that agreement in principle. It's a typical kind of process that you see in councils for making change, and it's important for this kind of change as well. Then after that, there's developing the plan itself. And we're going to touch on some elements here that are going to help you to consider developing that plan, and then even some of the implementation elements today. So thinking about the transition, maybe not a switch, looking at what are the superpowers for your LGA, for your council, where you've got advantages, and some of the barriers that might be holding you back, and what you might be able to do differently to overcome them. And we're going to consider today some of the actions in your planning process that you may not require, given the experience that we've had collectively. And then finally is looking at implementing the plan. So considering some of the early no regrets opportunities, looking at the changes you might need to make, the innovations you might need to take, and specifically looking at some of the change management as well that you need to incorporate in a plan, because this really is a change program as much as it is a technological program, and maybe even a procurement project as well.
I
So,
think that's a really
please.
good point, Nathan. And I think the reason we had a couple of funny conversations at council where people would say, can't we just buy a few cars, a few EVs? And we had to explain to them that, it's a new technology and that we need to, in the same way that when petrol stations were first set up and they needed to install big fuel tanks, we need to think about charging now. So there's a little bit more planning than just a procurement of an EV. And that's what we found the action plan useful for, to tease all those ideas out and work out what we were going to need to do and in what sequence. And I think you wanted me to talk a little bit more about the project control group. Is that right?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
once we've got that sort of agreement in principle, you're going to need a project control group. And so, what we were going to do is have a little bit of insight from Claudia on some of the things you might need.
Yeah, I think this will be obvious to a lot of people, but we needed to involve quite a few different departments of council in order to get the transition plan right. And obvious candidates are fleet and sustainability because they both have a very strong interest in it. But we also found that other areas of council were important. So, say, for example, HR, because they had a strong involvement in the way that especially the policies for the passenger vehicle use were set up, and also had a good understanding of, the staff and their union rules, etc. Then finance has an interest not
Mm.
just for budget, but also for, depreciation and fringe benefits tax. Facilities and capital planning were important because we were looking at putting charging stations in depots and offices, and they were very important, obviously, as part of that because they delivered the projects. So the PCG, I don't know if the PCG is used universally in all the different councils that might be on the line, but I know it's common language for council. And of course, what it means for most of us is a group of relatively senior folks who can oversee the development of the transition plan and provide um, input and an understanding of what the issues associated with their department might be. They help us facilitate it. They help us explain it to the executive, etc. So typically it depends. Typically it tends to be manager level, perhaps director level, depending on the nature and size of your council. But we also found that we needed a project working group, obviously, to do the detail. And we needed the executive involved as well because our PCG was managerial level. So we'd have the executive in there more just on a sort of a briefing level. They would get briefed on the stages of the plan and where it was all at key points. We also found that we involved other stakeholders, but they weren't always involved in the PCG or the PWG. So, for example, procurement, that'll vary between councils, but we found that Fleet had a lot of control over their own procurement process. So, procurement was engaged but not involved in detail. Resource recovery was obviously really important in terms of garbage trucks, but because we had the garbage trucks coming later in the transition plan, later in the staging, we didn't want to use up all their time talking about the passenger vehicles which came first. So it's important to think about when they should get involved. And the same goes for if you've got a separate group of people who are involved in the depot management, then they obviously need to be involved. So we found that to get all these people interested in and involved, we needed to do some upfront work almost before we invited them onto the project. And that was a range of initial discussions where we just sort of had a chat. The other thing that we found really helpful was test drives. So we had the initial discussions just so people could ask the basic questions about electric vehicles and trucks and how they work. Then the test drives were great for letting people know that although the technology might be a bit different, when you're actually driving it, it's not so different at all. You never look most people don't look under the hood to figure out how their ICE engine's working, and the same applies to EVs. We also had supplier briefings especially for the heavier vehicles, because there's a little more complexity there, and that was really useful because people like resource recovery could ask really detailed questions of the suppliers. So yeah, we found this whole process very helpful.
Yeah, it was a really good process to be part of, and
Yeah,
just seeing the aha moments from folks
yeah.
along the way, which was really important, I think. So building that into your plan is one of the messages we love you to take away from today. As we sort of move beyond the project control group, I want to start having a think about what will go into your plan. And at the moment, we're just going to break down a few things. We want to talk to you a little bit about staging your plan and what's important to your organisation. Have a look at some of the early wins. consider the things you probably don't need, having done quite a few plans now, and and thinking about the value from your end of the spectrum, and then also the sorts of things you will need within your plan, and starting to almost develop a checklist, which is one of the resources that you'll take away from today's session. So we're thinking about the whole concept of a transition plan, or a transition across the whole of society. There seems to be this false pressure that we have to make a 100% change to the fleet. The amount of times I've had a conversation about, yeah, but we can't take a triple road train to Darwin. Kind of discussion. It's like, yeah, you're right, and we're not going to anytime soon. Maybe never with electric, and maybe it'll be other solutions. So we really need to be thinking about this as a transition. It's gradual. It happens over time. It happens as you change your fleet out and so on. And look, the challenge is that council fleets are quite complex. They're like little fleets within fleets, whether that be the pool car network or the job car, the staff car network, whether that be heavy vehicles or light commercial vehicles, so on and so forth. They're all there as mini fleets with mini activity profiles within them, and so certain suitability will change. And so to help represent that, I wanted to sort of talk about the potential to change vehicles within the fleet sort of changes, and that teal color representing kind of the electrification potential, and the black color and the sort of keeping on oil. You see there in private cars, or sorry, light cars. Pool cars are easier to do than private cars. It's pretty simple. There's basically charging implications and even range implications there. So, as a general rule, similarly with light commercial vehicles and those tradie vehicles kind of arrangements, whether they be pool vehicles or tool of trade vehicles for your electricians and plumbers and so on that might be within council, those vehicles, they have a tendency to have a consistency with the work that they do, an envelope in where they might operate, and so they might also be quite, or at least a portion of those vehicles could be transitioned reasonably quickly. And similarly in the trucks, which was an area we're looking to focus a little bit on today, because the car thing has been done for a while, but as we mentioned before, trucks are still burgeoning, but they're there now. Ultimately, you can see that my experience with Claudia and the other dozen councils I've worked with, is that within the fleet, the little tiny fleets of the type of activity that trucks do, there's certain ones that are more likely to be electrifiable, if that's a word, early than others. An example of ones that are really challenging would be a road sweeper, and we often hear, oh, we want to do the road sweepers, mostly because they use the most fuel. They use the most fuel because they're very energy intensive, which makes them very, very hard to electrify today. It'll come, it's just a while away. I mean, those vehicles are using like 100 litres, 100 Ks, or even more, 125 litres, 100 Ks. So when you think about replacing that energy for batteries, it's actually very heavy, very dense, and can result in, just more batteries than there is body. So they're the later ones. But some of the early ones that are really opportunities, that have opportunity, are tippers, tray vehicles, hard waste vehicles with cages on the back of them, vehicles that have a fairly consistent activity. They have a bit of a roster, they go around the traps, and they're ready to go with solutions that are available now. But really, no council fleet has the ability to transition all of their vehicles away from diesel today. It will come, but it's still certain sectors and fleets within fleets that are going to be more challenging. So just be aware of that in the process that you're looking at. Now, I mentioned about superpowers, and I really think this is the case for councils, that some councils have, each council has its own geographic and spatial and, building elements that mean that that vehicles being transitioned into the fleet have positives and negatives that might come towards the transition piece. But typically vehicles travel inside an LGA, which means it's a defined area that you can work with. It's a bit of an envelope. Some of them are in predictable patterns. So it's Tuesday, we're going to pick the bins up from the northern end of council, and then they're often on a rotational roster. The sites within council are owned and controlled, as opposed to I've worked on delivery fleets that their vehicles squat on a customer's site before they go and deliver that customer's gear, goods and services. So you're in that box seat of having ownership and control over your site, and you typically have quite long-term thinking and commitments that are made. So all of these things drive generally the pace of transition that you can work with. So consider those as some of your superpowers, and also some of the things that might have to be innovated around as you go through the process.
And I think the point that you're making with all those superpowers, especially, traveling inside the LGA, is that it means that the distance that the vehicles travel, or the way they travel and return to depots, means that you have great charging opportunities compared to some long haul freight companies, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely spot on. So bringing those into the place, we're going to go in a little deeper detail in that in a short while, but wanted to sort of bring that concept to your mind. Now, we said there before that there's some things that you might be able to do within your fleet that could get some early wins, and I wanted to touch on some of those case studies that have done well for councils and other fleets that are quite similar to council behaviour, and those are these ones here. So pool cars are clearly, back to base, live at a depot, can be charged from reasonably light or slow charging solutions. They operate within the LGA. Typically, sometimes you might do meetings nearby, but you're typically not driving a pool car super far. And it also gives the opportunity for many to experience EVs, and that's got to be part of your process of the plan, is engaging with all sorts of users across council to understand what it's like to go there. And then you've got some of the more commercial ones, which seemingly have been a little bit held back from over recent years. But there is an opportunity for those vehicles to be part of your early win opportunities. So particularly vans for those trade type roles, or even we were spitballing an idea there before, Claudia, about some of the pool vehicles are actually used to transfer equipment, event gear, paperwork, some other smaller tools and things, where a van might be actually really quite useful. And whilst we don't have utes on the market quite yet, they're a couple of years away, the van space is quite strong, and there's plenty of options, plenty of really good vans on there. And then there's the light truck space. That space is really matured. So, a couple of years ago, there really wasn't that much available, but now that's matured, and these vehicles are quite capable. Great payloads, typically operated out of a back to base, have towing capability. You own them for longer, so that often helps with the pricing and the cost element. And we talked before about the added amenity, the quietness. So the vehicle could be in effect idling in the point of work, but no one would ever know. And so that's a great opportunity for those kinds of vehicles which are out and about in the public.
Absolutely.
I just wanted to mark those.
Yeah, and I think there might be a few people on the line wondering why, just looking at those typical passenger vehicles, why pool vehicles rather than private vehicles, the ones that individual staff are using. Well, Nathan's already mentioned why the pool vehicles are simple, but don't feel like the privately used vehicles are difficult either. It really comes down to the individuals who are driving them. So what we found is that some people were super keen to swap over immediately to EV, and in fact, we couldn't move fast enough for them.
Yep.
And then there's some people who have complications, like it's more difficult for them to charge it. Exactly. Yeah. More difficult for them to charge at home is typically the issue. But yeah.
And so, absolutely. Within that pool group is also those private vehicles that are self-selectors. I use the term. Exactly, so folks who are keen to get on it is another opportunity. Controversial, but I've done quite a few of these, and I wanted to give you a bit of an insight of maybe where you could find some savings of time, effort, and money, and that's really about aspects of your transition plan that you might not need. I've written several transition plans that have got copious amounts of background information on technology and plug types and so on and so forth. And the reality is we've moved beyond that. You still probably need it, but what I would say is get it from sources that are available. And as with the whole program today, but also this slide, there are sources that I'm going to provide to you as part of a resource pack that will give you links to just this kind of information. Total cost of ownership. I have done reams and pages of calculations of vehicles that are out of date the moment that I've written them. And that's because the market moves quickly. That's because your organization has specific ways it looks to account for some elements. And so it's really important, I believe, that you're using internal data and you're really pulling that stuff together internally. You might need some support from somebody, but ultimately outsourcing the total cost of ownership calculation is probably not the best value of to council. Lists of models of vehicles. Again, move so quickly. There's tens of models that have come on the market this year that you wouldn't have heard about unless you were following that kind of market. But there are several websites which are kept up to date really, really well, particularly the NRMA, and there's a particular media site, The Driven, who have got some great databases. Again, those resources are in the pack. And then finally, the amount of 100-page consultant tomes I've written that now sit in dusty drawers. It's kind of a shame. I mean, it needs to be done, but at the same time, finding that balance for your situation, for your need to build an internal plan where you can, and maybe get a sprinkling of external support such that you can get to an outcome that is, reasonably quick, reasonably cost effective, and ultimately doesn't hold you back from being able to make the kinds of journey that you need to do, probably saving some money along the way. Have you ever heard of consultants saying don't buy consulting services? Well, here you go. I'm saying it. What are you likely to need within your plan? So one of the things I've found to be most useful is a bit of a mindset change when you're coming towards your plan. And that is the next vehicle purchased will be an EV unless ... What are the things that would hold us back? So unless there is a suitable vehicle available, there's no utes. Okay, no utes. Well, maybe then that vehicle would be EV. The next purchase of a vehicle of that nature would be when there's utes available. Or question, could it be a van? That's another opportunity as well, depending on your appetite for change. But really looking at it through this lens. So a couple of the key points you're going to need are to consider what's unique to council. There's so many aspects, and we'll deal with some of them in the final phase of this webinar. But there are those superpowers and those specific challenges that you might be looking for, which will help with the staging of your plan. There's the need to modify policies. There will be policies, purchasing policies, written and unwritten, in your fleet today, in your processes today, that mean that they will be holding back EV purchases. They're unintentional. They've been there for a long while. They've just been business as usual, but you'll probably find elements. And I'm going to talk about some of those as well. Charging. Charging is probably the newest part to it, and we're going to delve into that in the next section, give you some hints and tips. Fleet budget. Can't buy something if you don't have the money for it. So there are some challenges with fleet budget, but there's also some opportunity. And so sometimes we lean into the challenges, but not so much the opportunities. There might be some windfalls that you'd be able to take advantage of. And really need to be reasonable about how you consider the future of EVs. Considering a very, very low depreciation or a very low residual value is not going to help the case. And so being reasonable with that is a good example of setting yourself up for success. A procurement plan. You're going to need this. This is really the heart of the overall plan. It's the meat. It's going to have in there the vehicles, when they're going to change, how they operate, and then you're able to pass that plan through the procurement rules that you set up, and then ultimately that drops out your speed of change.
Yeah, for the sustainability folks, there's a spreadsheet out there somewhere with your fleet managers that lists every vehicle that council has and how much fuel it uses and who uses it, and all those other things. When it's due for replacement is the key thing. Yeah.
and we look to build on that with other information that we'll add to that spreadsheet. It's already 50 columns long, but we're going to throw a few extras in there that will help you to make that decision process. And then there's that piece in your plan. And if you take something away from today, is remembering that part of your plan needs to include change management for the drivers, for your leadership, for maintenance and support functions, and so on. So we're going to talk a little bit about how you can do that too. But just before that, and I haven't checked over in the chat function, we're going to take a quick pause for questions. Hoping that there might be a couple there that have popped up so far. Our next section we're going to go into is working through the plan and providing you some approaches and insights to build momentum. But until that point, thought I'd just take a few minutes to see if we can find a couple of questions and work through those.
There's a question about what total cost of ownership means.
Yeah, great. And there's also another question about capex. So the kind of similarity. So total cost of ownership. Let's just break that one down for a second. Basically, all of the costs that vehicle will incur within fleet, within the council for the whole of its life. So I'll use an example. A truck might be in your fleet for 6 years. Total cost of ownership includes the component that is the capital cost minus what you can sell it for at the end, or what you do realize to sell it for at the end. And so that gives you your total capital expenditure. There's servicing, there's fuel. You may choose to look at things. There'll be non-warranty elements of repair. Thing blows up a gearbox and it's out of warranty. That's all part of your total cost of ownership. It happens. And then also there's elements like you may include tires, other consumables, brakes. That's sort of part of your servicing space. In some occasions, if I was looking at my own total cost of ownership for my own personal car, I'd be looking at things like insurance as well. All of these things all dropping in to the whole basket of costs. And fuel's a big one. So considering real world fuel costs, which we'll do a little bit more digging into in the next section. I've got a question there around capex. So we will talk a little bit about that in the next section, but overall there's going to be an increase in capex. Typically, vehicles are more expensive to purchase when they're electric vehicles, but they're cheaper to run. And so when you talk about that total cost of ownership, there's going to be a shift from your operating costs to an upfront cost element. And so that changes the behavior of the balance sheet, that changes the behavior of budgetary requirements, and that is part of the rule set changing, or the rule conversations that are going to need to happen as part of the process for your changes. We've got, do trucks require dedicated infrastructure? Typically, I would expect that all electric vehicles at this point in time should have a 1-to-1 ratio of charger to vehicle. There'll come a time when that's maybe not the case, but right now, in your 1s and 2s and 10s and 20s that you'll do in the initial space, it'll be certainly a 1-to-1. Now, there's nothing dedicated in the fact that it's a similar type of charger. It's the same plug, and so on. And so there is some cross-pollination capability, and we'll dig a little bit more into what you can do around charging and some of the innovations that are in the space in a short while. Just checking to see if there are any other questions. I've got those couple there. Can you see any others, Claudia, that I'm missing? Awesome. Well, what we might do is take our opportunity to move to the next section and start having a look at more of the detail. Really give you something to take away from the conversation. So we're going to work through the plan. And I think one of the messages as we head into this is around building confidence confidence for yourselves with your planning and so on, but also confidence in all the stakeholders that are within council that are going to interact with this process. There's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of poor information out there, and it's really a challenge to overcome some of that poor information, to help with building confidence, to help with overcoming the barriers, which are in most part non-technical. They are mostly informational, and so we're going to work through some of those as well. So talk about the plan, and this is really as you're working through your process. I'm going to start with the end in mind. And the end is to buy an EV, but it's really not to buy an EV. It's to benefit from the attributes of an EV. So whether that's the emissions reduction opportunity, or it's the amenity opportunity, or it's being involved in these early stages, getting involved in technology change, just doing the learning is another part of the benefits, and certainly one that I've seen in some of the fleets that I've put electric trucks into, the delivery fleets. Just going through the process of living with an EV for them has been a major part of their learning. So if we start with
that's really true, actually, of council's experience as well.
Yeah.
Even if you're at the point where you can just get a few passenger vehicles in place, your learning increases exponentially.
Absolutely. And just that early truck or two will really help you with those the different kinds of challenges, or different kinds of experiences, not challenges, experiences that come with those kinds of vehicles. Sure. So if we start with the end in mind, hey, we want to buy a vehicle, I'm going to take you on a little bit of a map, a bit of a journey. And that really starts with working on the rules that allow a purchase. It's difficult to buy something if you're not allowed to. So that's an area where you're going to need to start. And then once you've got that sort of sorted out and knocked into shape, you're really looking at what is the replacement timing? What is the timing process for doing your transition? And it's typically aligned to vehicles you're going to replace anyway. It's not like you're going to go out and sell a vehicle you bought last week. That would be silly, but the one that's coming up for renewal is the perfect place to start. So if we're going to start with that vehicle, what are we going to do to it? Well, we need to work out, is that vehicle going to work? What is the task of that vehicle? What is the behavior and activity that it does? What is its job? We take that vehicle's job, and we're looking at the size and type of vehicle, maybe what payload it needs to carry. We're looking at the distance that it's traveling, or the energy that it needs to use. And we're then obviously comparing that to vehicles that are available in the marketplace. And if there's a vehicle that's available that will be suitable for that job, we can then start to consider what kind of charging it might require. Now, as we've been pulling that, we talked about that mega spreadsheet before. As we're pulling that together, we're dropping some of this information into it. We know we've got an understanding as to when that vehicle is going to be replaced from that sheet. We're going to understand what department it lives in and so on. Maybe the type of activity and kilometres that it's using. They are proxies for energy. And then we're starting to consider, what is its location? Where is it based? Oh, it's based at depot X, not depot Y. Okay. Has it got its own dedicated spot? That might be a conversation from a physical point of view, and access to your charging. And then what speed of charging is required? What rate of charging is basically how much energy do we need versus how much time we've got. Once we've got that sussed out and we've got a bit of a charging concept, we can then have a conversation about cost. Can't really do cost until you've worked out what the vehicle is we're going to replace it with and how we're going to charge it. And that's a really important part. So we want to work out what the real world costs are of the incumbent vehicle, and then start to model out what are the costs of the proposed replacement vehicle. We've got to consider the budget, and we're going to have a reflection on those rules. And there might be a little bit of a return to the orange circle or the orange square, where we might need to, get the panel beater tools out and knock the rules into shape a little bit. Then there's an important part. Some folks just skip to, right, I've got a cost, I've got a quote, I'll go and buy a vehicle. And it can do that, but the change management process is really going to help you make that process smoother. It's going to help you with taking everybody on the journey. That's a message I want to take away today. So supporting all of the users and decision makers and so on through a change management plan, and particularly supporting the maintenance team if you have on-site maintenance or whoever's managing the maintenance process, to understand what they're in for, understand what is going to be different and what they're going to experience. And there we go. We've got ourselves an EV. So that's all we need to do, isn't it? Not quite. I really think it's important to consider your implementation post-purchase, the training that's required, the engagement with basically whoever's sold you that vehicle, the dealer, manufacturer might support you with the post-purchase implementation stuff, and also monitoring the vehicle afterwards. You don't know if it's working well. What's the feedback look like? Simple change management, things like surveys or interactions, conversations, and even telematics, where you're going to find out a bit more information about how it's being used, utilization. So these are some of the key things that we're going to work through over the course of the next few minutes to look at each portion of this and consider how you might, and consider some insights on how to make it better, easier, learn from some of the insights that we've had along the way. I'm just going to take this map and consider your superpowers again, those concepts of those things that might really work within council to help, and also maybe some of those kryptonites that are along the way that we can then work out how to avoid or overcome. So some examples of some opportunities, particularly with things with the vehicle task and the distance and energy you require. There's smaller geographical LGAs or even large LGAs that have smaller clusters. I live in Brisbane. I'm here in Brisbane City Council, and it's the biggest council in the world, and it's got zones. So depots that are on one side of the city don't support activity that's right on the other side of the city. It's almost like a mini LGA in itself. So using that as a benefit for not needing range that's quite as that's huge. We're not driving to Darwin. The other one is, unless we're from Darwin City Council, clearly. And then the other one is consistency of tasks. So many of, particularly the commercial vehicles, but also things like pool vehicles, they are consistently going back and forth between depot and depot, or sites or suppliers and so on. So using that consistency of task. And then just another call out over here is around cost and using your budget. So ultimately, you get to set the rules. Flexible ownership terms are something you can do. Maybe over the years, you've changed from being 2-year vehicle ownership to 3-year vehicle ownership. It's a budget save. Why not 4-year ownership? Those sorts of things can be thought about. Same thing with trucks and commercial vehicles. Similarly, with taking the wins from upside. So over the last 3 or 4 years, resale values have been through the roof. We've also not been able to buy vehicles, so we've continued to hold on to a vehicle for longer, 3, 6 months, 8 months, whatever it might be. There will be budgetary wins that have occurred through that process that might be something that you could realize to drive pilot activity in this new technology space. So consider that. There are other areas which have some ups and downs maybe. So maintenance, less time required, lower costs, but that might in time, certainly not early on, but in time, change the way the workshop looks. So you need to consider some of those things. And then there's some areas which are a little more challenging. If we take the charging in the top right-hand corner, you might be tight on space because you need spaces to put the charging and places for vehicles to park. So that could be something to consider. If you've got some particularly old buildings, there was one old building that we had at Inner West Council with electricity that was, came in with Adam, was just going to be a real challenge. So we're going to have to do a bunch of work there. And then also home charging. I've got it there as a challenge and it's in red, but it doesn't have to be such a hard time. There are plenty of innovations around that space. And then there's outdated rules, and I'm going to go into some detail about those right now. So having that concept of next vehicle purchase will be an EV unless is a good challenge statement to the kinds of work. And you can use it to game out the approach to new vehicles in the fleet. Some of the rules that we've seen in the past that slow down or halt EV purchasing and EV planning have been things like certain brands or certain places of manufacture, countries of manufacture, have been considered a not appropriate purchase approach. The world's changed a lot. I do remember, years and years ago, there were certain parts of the world and manufacturers and so on that you wouldn't be caught dead in, and those vehicles currently top, or certainly in the top 5 of all vehicles sold. So, what we're starting to see is the need to be a little less attached to that and just start to have a look at the capability and economics of the vehicles that we have. We've seen rules like you can't buy something that's got leather seats. A lot of EVs have a nicer spec. We're starting to see vehicles in general receive maybe not leather, but certainly pleather, polyurethane leather. And so those specs are just the way they are. So is that going to preclude you from buying one? Maximum purchase ceilings, that needs to change, where we've got a change in the capex model, which we'll explore a little further. And for years and years, fleets have been really attuned to getting a fleet discount, and some manufacturers have just chosen not to behave like that. Fleets are otherwise, and so we've got an online purchasing process. We've got a simple one price fits all kind of approach, and if we have this no fleet discount, no purchase approach, there's whole brands and whole vehicles you won't be able to buy. There's also some potential to bring in new rules that might assist the process. So things like an internal carbon price. And I know corporates that have done this, where they've built their plans slightly differently, and they've put in a pretty aggressive internal carbon price, which has helped to overcome some of the cost challenges, because, hey, that's a real thing if you're thinking about it like it. Also seeing targets, and those might be mini targets within those mini fleet sectors that I talked about earlier. And we're going to be 100% cars by 2030. Might be a target you choose to use as a message sender. There's also some other tools that you might use. So those who've been in fleet for a long time might recall things with the Green Vehicle Guide, was the Green Star rating. Well, in the last 3 months or so, the New South Wales government and the federal government have partnered to put out the new Vehicle Emissions Star rating, VESA. It's using the same concepts basically as the Green Star rating, but it's updated for the modern time. It's a 6-star rating, and it might be something you could include in your purchasing rules, where vehicles must achieve a certain star rating to be allowed to be in the fleet, just like you do with crash ratings and so on like that. So safety ratings. So consider those kinds of rules in your process. You'll see a little map down the bottom corner, and we're following the process. So we're now going to shift from rules towards transition.
Nathan, just before you move on,
Yes, ma'am.
we just had a question about internal carbon price, which I can probably address right now.
Go for it.
So basically, it's looking at putting a dollar figure on a ton of carbon, and saying, right, well, when we are emitting carbon as an organisation, we've got to take that cost into account. So it's just like another line item, as you would have with your fuel. You'd have a cost for the amount of carbon you're emitting. So for a lot of people, well, I think what Nathan was referring to is a theoretical price on carbon, but you can actually there's an actual cost as well for councils, because if you have a target that you have to meet on the amount of carbon the council is emitting, then if you have something that is emitting carbon, you've actually got to buy something called carbon offsets. And that will sound very familiar to all the sustainability people. You've got to buy carbon offsets, and you can use the anticipated value of those carbon offsets as your carbon price. It's going to be a real cost to carbon, and it's a real cost to council unless you go zero emissions.
And that number is sometimes a little low. And so what I've seen is, it's broadly something like 25 or 30 bucks a ton. But it's I've seen organizations choose to inflate that number because of their choice on how they would like to be also not just carbon offsetting, but actually properly carbon neutral.
Exactly. Yeah.
So if we move on and have a look at this sort of rate of transition, this is talking about that spreadsheet, representation of that spreadsheet, which becomes the heart of your plan. Almost all of the results of your plan fall out of a spreadsheet that is going to be talking about the vehicle, its segment, what sort of work it does, or the department that it lives in, where does it live, where's its home base, that supports charging insights, how much driving does it do, an average can be helpful, peak daily activity is better. And then it's, consider that and then filtering by replacement timing. So, what are we replacing next? We can start to consider the sort of things that the vehicles that might be being replaced in the next 6 months, and they might be our early targets, or the next 12 months, whatever time frame you feel you can work to. And then considering that carbon piece, it might be another driver for you to think about what's more important, where should we put the effort? And this concept here that, sort of put out is you can estimate the lifetime carbon from that vehicle. It won't be super accurate, but it will be close enough for you to consider what is the fuel consumption or the fuel use over time. So that's sort of fuel consumption by kilometers, and then against the carbon intensity factor, which again in our resources, all that information is going to be provided. And you can see here these are real world kind of carbon intensities that you would have, or carbon outputs you would have for the lifetime of a vehicle in a council fleet. And there's several times more from some vehicles than others, and that might change your view on what to do, what to have a go at first. And then clearly within this sheet, which by no means is this slide comprehensive, but giving you an overview, you'll need to talk about cost, and we'll break down cost concepts in a few moments. But you'll need to include an estimate of the current cost versus the future cost, and give you a bit of a delta so that you can start to consider budgeting at a vehicle by vehicle and also at a aggregated approach. We have a little bit of a move on to sort of vehicle suitability. As I said before, you want to find out about vehicles that are suitable in a market, get Google out, it's your friend, but also the resources that we provide you will give you some insights too. But having a look at the range, range has changed a lot on vehicles in the last sort of 4 or 5 years. These are real world expected ranges for vehicle types that you'll see out there be able to buy today. You can get 200 Ks out of trucks. You can get 300 plus Ks, 350 Ks out of cars and SUVs today. One battery, no concerns. So really using that as a benchmark. The range thing is generally much less of a concern than it used to be. And then coming back to those unique advantages, those superpowers, you're able to work within your space and your plan. And there's also the idling piece. So if you've got a vehicle that idles for a long period of time, EVs are amazing for that. They don't use a lot of energy. They will sit there pumping out the air conditioning. They're not making noise. They're not making emissions. And you're getting the typical outcome. Great for trucks, great for tradie vehicles. I also want to bring light to the whole public charging space. A lot of folks think there's not a lot of public charging. I might be a little bit on the controversial side. I think there's actually a lot of public charging in Australia today. There's over 1,000 sites now, and that's the fast stuff. There's plenty more slow stuff. And it's spread all over the country. You can literally drive around the country with an electric car today, the whole country. And it's being done quite often. I've got 3 or 4 friends currently doing a lap in an electric vehicle. There's many more in the works. So whilst you wouldn't rely on public charging as your number one solution for a vehicle in council, I would not necessarily advise that at this point in time. There are plenty of backups. And staying on charging, wanted to tip into into charging a little bit. It is a new world. It is new to most of us. It's new to users, and it's new to change managers like yourself here. It's going to be, it could be a little bit complex. And a few years ago, it was really a one-size-fits-all approach. But now we're starting to see some innovative and new approaches that reduce some of the barriers, particularly the early entry barriers that we might see. And I think one of the things I really try to say to folks around charging is that the charging charging really needs to be as fast as necessary, but as slow as possible. There's several reasons for that, but really it's related to cost. The faster the charging, the more it's going to cost, and the more infrastructure that's going to be needed to be impacted generally. So if you can find a way to slow charge vehicles and still get the job done, that's the way to go. And I've got a little bit of a surprise here because I'd like to invite Austin Devaney from EVSE to come across and jump on. I think he's able to be jumping on there and take us through a little bit around some of the solutions, some of those innovative solutions that he's started to be able to use with organisations and councils out there. Have I got you there?
Yes. Thanks, Nathan.
Brilliant. Excellent.
Great. Hello, everybody. So my name's Austin Devaney. I'm the head of sales for EVSE Australia. If you don't know what we do, we're a turnkey EV charging company within the industry. And more importantly, we do a lot of work with councils. And so I can speak to a bit of experience here. I think the first thing that Nathan and Claudia have touched on is really understanding how you operate your vehicles. What you can see here is some portable charging, but the first thing you need to do is understand their dwell time, how long they stay parked at sites for, how do they operate them, so how long do they drive around town and then come back to base, or do they go home to charge at the home? So really understanding that initial step can allow you to frame and pick the right charging station for you. From what we've seen, most councils start off by getting 1 or 2 electric vehicles. It's not a huge transition up front, but it allows for them to get comfortable with the technology, as well as to get comfortable with how to use the charging stations, as well as to use the vehicles. What you can see here is actually some solutions that don't allow you to have to implement charging infrastructure at your site and have to afford to pay for installation and costs such as that. What these do, so on the left-hand side, AC portable charging is an option. It can allow you to really delve into the EV world, be able to get a vehicle, be able to plug in at one of your sites that has existing ports, eliminating any installation costs, and being able to charge your vehicles reliably. If you had larger vehicles such as trucks, or they needed faster charging, there's DC options for portable charging like you can see here on the right-hand side. This is actually a really nice unit because it allows to get a fast charge to your vehicles without actually having to do any installations at all. You can see in that photo on the right-hand side, it just plugs into a standard 5-pin outlet. Portable chargers are safe, they're reliable, and we've sold thousands of them across Australia. And it's certainly a viable option if you'd like to dip your toes into the EV world to get comfortable and get accustomed to what an electric vehicle is and how to charge them. Awesome. The next slide is probably one of the most important slides in understanding the power availability at your sites. So what we like to do is we firstly go, okay, well, how do you operate your vehicles, which allows us to determine the right charging stations for you. But you'll also then need to have a look at your infrastructure at your sites. Power availability is hugely important because as your fleet grows, your power will reduce in your building. So you need a way to be able to manage that safely and securely and allow your charging stations to scale. Using load management technology, you can allow to have 4 times as many chargers in your buildings than if you didn't have that, which can really help a fleet prevent having to upgrade their infrastructure at sites, which can cost a huge amount of money. But also it saves on extended timelines working with network operators. And more importantly, it protects your building from tripping. So what you can see on the right-hand side is this, all good. There's just 3 different options which allow you to have a bit of flexibility in terms of what you want to load control, from both an online version to a physical module in your building. And then you can even do schedule-based load control, where you'd like to incentivize people to charge at certain times of the day. And that can help, optimize your ongoing costs. Fantastic. So this is the last slide, but it's a pretty important slide. It's a case study that we have worked with Canterbury Bankstown Council in New South Wales. So we partnered with them around 4 years ago, or 5 years ago, 2019. And over that period of time, they originally started with 1 EV at one site. They told us how they operated their vehicles. They were pull vehicles. They drove around 50 kilometers of range per day. But as they became comfortable with that technology, they expanded out. So over 4 years, today they now have 50 charging stations across 5 sites in Sydney, and have one of the largest electric fleets in Australia for a council. And they are able to visualize all of that data through smart software platforms that really give them the understanding of, okay, well, who's charging, how much electricity are they consuming, and then be able to do that reporting on the back end for ESG, or to understand if you need to increase your charging infrastructure. And then I guess the last piece is that ongoing service and maintenance. Once you've really nailed down the charging infrastructure, it's all installed, it's super important to consider the ongoing support piece. You want to make sure your chargers are supported for 10 years. You want to make sure they're healthy. And just like any electrical component, maintenance, or like test and tagging, is a process in place where you can help to maintain your charging infrastructure as you go.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you, Austin. I think that data piece, understanding where your vehicle charging is it operating, is it not, even down to things like remote diagnostics. They're really important as part of the process to make sure you've got uptime and activity. I've been on the other end of using that kind of gear. Someone's turned the power off on the charger, and I get a notification, and just in that itself, it's worth it. So thanks very much for dipping in and being a little bit of a cameo there on charging, and showing us some of the new and innovative solutions around load management, which we're getting more from less, and then also some of the mobile solutions, which means that you've got a lower footprint of startup cost, if you like, or startup barrier to entry. So that's awesome.
Absolutely, no problem. And if there's any questions, feel free to shoot them into the chat. I'm more than happy to help.
Brilliant. And we're going to keep going with our little map down the bottom here. You can see I've moved over to sort of costs area now, and we'll come on to some of the other points in the map in a moment. What I've found over the last maybe 6 or 12 months, talking to all sorts of fleet types and all sorts of folks, is that there's a potential that some are looking at 2024, 25 through 2020 lenses. The market has changed greatly. The vehicles, the charging, even the pricing has changed greatly. And a perfect example of that would be, one of the small EVs, entry-level EVs that are on the marketplace. In 2020, ZSEV, small ZSEV was $47,000. Its petrol variant kind of mid to high 20s, right? So there's this double the cost kind of concept. Today, it's a $40,000 car, and they've brought an upgrade where it's got a 12% larger battery. The market has shifted. It continues to shift. So just keeping yourself up to date, and with modern quotes and modern bits and pieces. And the same thing goes for trucks. The truck market has grown greatly. There's so many more options. There's so many more combinations that can be built. Payloads that are available. So that whole concept of like trucks aren't ready. Again, a takeaway from today is trucks are ready. There are some really great combinations, particularly that suit council operations around, parks and gardens and mowing and hard rubbish and all those sorts of activities that are really great. And before it was like, oh, you want a truck, it's going to take 2 years to get one. No, there's decent availability. Those vehicles are around, they are in stock, they are available, and then even things like bodybuilders are ready to start working on them. So that is a viable choice, really. And just leaving you with that concept of the market has matured massively in this last 5 years. Literally 5 years ago, the EV uptake, or the market share for EVs in the light vehicle space was about 1%, and today it's 10. For electric, it was about 5 to 8 vehicles a year, and now it's like 300. So, and that's going to double, triple this year. So, it's definitely a matured market. And I wanted to delve into cost, and this goes back to some of the questions we had earlier. And so hopefully this slide helps a little bit deeper with this, and I'll pause on it for a few moments. So What we've got down the bottom here is a graph that in dark blue shows the capital cost as a percentage of total cost of ownership. And I'm using a truck because I've got some good data on that. And the orange section is the operational costs. So in that bucket are things like servicing, is fuel and tires and so on and so forth. All of that, and ongoing maintenance, and particularly with trucks, you've got longer time. You might even have, you've got the cost of component failure, which is non-warranted. That all sort of goes into the orange bucket. And on an EV, you end up typically paying more at the beginning of the life of the vehicle, CapEx, but you're paying a significantly lower amount for OpEx. Energy is way cheaper. Maintenance is really much lower in most cases, and those two, in effect, pay back the cost. And so there's always going to be a crossover point with an EV and an ICE vehicle that is based on how many kilometers it travels and how long you hold on to it for. Hold on to it for longer, the capital element starts to wash out. You do more kilometers in it, you'll burn more fuel, and the ICE vehicle will end up becoming more expensive, and the savings that you get from an EV start to really come on board. Give you a bit of an idea of the capital expenditure, realities for cars. You've actually got plenty of vehicles that are the same price today for an EV as they are for an equivalent ICE vehicle. Without question, that is possible. And then, if you're starting to look at, certain features and certain brands and certain segments of the car market, you might have an up to twice the cost. But, you can buy a Corolla and compare it to a Tesla Model 3, and there's a difference of times 2 there, but you're comparing almost apples and pears. You get this savings that are coming back through running costs. And then in the case with light vehicles, there's also the fringe benefits tax side of things. I'm not going to go into that today, but that's something to consider, particularly for those vehicles that are used for private use. And then having a look at trucks, trucks can be somewhere around 1.5 times to 3 times the capital cost, depending on the size and arrangement and body and lots of different bits and pieces. But ultimately, that is a difference. But again, the savings come about. So with that, it's really getting current quotes. Go out to those providers, those manufacturers, those dealers, and get current quotes of the vehicle. Surprise yourself about what the real world cost is today of that versus maybe the incumbent vehicle's replacement if you were going to go diesel, and just stick them up next to each other. Stack those numbers up next to each other. There are plenty of calculators out and about that you could use, but most fleet managers would know, and the likes of AFMA and IPWEA, they all have guidance on how to do these calculations as well.
In addition to which, a lot of councils have the benefits of bulk purchasing. So I know certainly in New South Wales there's a bulk purchasing arrangement through the state government, and we found that the dealers were happy to provide the discounts for the EVs, but we had to educate them first. I think that work's probably done, at least in New South Wales now, but just be aware there are still discounts out there. You might just, government discounts, you might just have to ask about it and push for it on the capital front.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. They just might not know that they exist. That was our experience in 2019 or 2020. And then look, added to this, I wanted to talk a little bit about charging. Now, this graph where I sort of bring charging in at the top, it's not really how that would be counted for, but I wanted to sort of say there will potentially be charging costs for your EVs that are capital style costs. The energy cost is down here in the orange piece. It's somewhere in the order of 5 or 10 times cheaper than petrol, depending on what energy prices are. Everybody's is different, but the charging capital cost is something you'll need to consider on top of the EV cost. And like Claudia mentioned earlier, over the years with petrol vehicles, we've invested in bowsers and tanks on depot sites, or our petrol stations that are off-site, public petrol stations, they've invested in it for us, and that's in the cost of cost of petrol. So there will be this early life investment in new infrastructure, and this varies significantly. So, the kind of work that Austin does will provide insight into, if you've got access to energy issues, like it's an old site as well, those sorts of elements might increase cost. Or if you can plug it into the wall, like we saw with the mobile charger, then there's no cost in that space. Speed of charger, a slow charger is cheaper than a faster charger. Simple as that. Technology inside, what's going on inside, and again, if you want some more information on those kinds of conversations, plenty of information online, and the likes of Austin will be able to delve into that more. And then there's civil works, and one of the things I'd say is try and put your charging up against a wall rather than in the middle of the car park, because at least you can run the conduit against the wall than you can dig holes through the car park. And those are the sorts of things that you'll get advice from the likes of Austin for as well. So I know that this is quite high level. There's so much more to go into on cost, but I hope that there's some markers and some ideas through there. I'm going to move on to the next bit, which is that support side, and particularly touching on servicing. So many councils run a workshop, not all, but many. They have trained a mechanical workforce. They carry out servicing and maintenance works at the moment, but they also use dealers to support warranty work. It's often the case that the dealer won't allow workshops to do warranty work. It's busted. They need to have it diagnosed. They need to get it sorted out, and then they ultimately need to do the report and get the money back for the dealership. So, having been in that space and worked for many, many years in dealer and manufacturer land, I know how that works. So that's a reality of current state workshops. And then we look to compare that versus an EV environment. So there's new technologies and systems, there's no doubt about that. Some parts of the vehicle change, but many stay the same. So, wipers, washers, wheels, tires, brakes, it's all the same stuff, typically. And there's an overall reduced servicing requirement. So, there's no oil changes typically, or if they are, they're far further apart than they would be in an ICE vehicle. And so and most manufacturers will provide you with insight on the servicing regime. I've been involved deeply with the Photon truck servicing regime, and it's improved greatly over the years, pretty much chopped in half with further understanding, and now very much sales underneath an ICE vehicle, an ICE truck. And so what we need to do in this space here is consider the staged process to addressing those gaps. So first, the dark blue versus the light blue, what are the real gaps in your environment? Because every council is slightly different. And then start to consider the change that's required, and provide training for what is required when it's required. Training the whole entire shop before vehicle one lands is probably overkill. Again, in my resources that will send you, there's a bunch of links on where to get some training and places to look for that sort of stuff. And now I wanted to take you sort of on the drivers and operators process. There's going to need to be a bunch of effort in supporting knowledge insight. If this graph represents someone's knowledge and confidence of EVs, they're going to need to have some insight from where they are today, which you can expect is a fairly low base, to provide effort into giving them some support to learn, to build confidence that gets to a point where they're going to be able to deal with the change. It's like any other change curve. So sorts of things you might consider is experiential things, test drives, walkarounds, training sessions, Q&A workshops, and then using the dealer to help you with handovers and quick reference guides in that early post-delivery space. Definitely something that you can work together on. Most OEMs have those quick reference guides and quick user guides available to them. And I've got, go
Actually,
on,
before you
please.
move on, sorry there,
Yeah,
Nathan. Felix specifically asked about training for the workshop, and I think you've answered the question, but
sure.
just maybe you could talk a little bit more about where people can get the training from. I know it's in your resource pack, but perhaps
Yeah,
a little bit more
definitely.
colour there would be helpful.
Look, ultimately, basically every TAFE in Australia now has EV servicing and basically for safe use, and then also for diagnostic activity, decommission, recommission training. Those are all nationwide training packages. You've got all sorts of providers for that. So TAFEs, Motor Traders Associations have also hooked into this as well. So most states, Motor Traders Associations training departments will also offer that training, and then other RTOs are also offering that training. There are plenty, and yeah, again, is some of that information in the resource pack. And one of the things, and it's basically last slide, I wanted to touch on, it's just coming back round to the sound of pushback. And for me, it's always been, yeah, but. And almost all objections to EVs can be addressed with some sort of info or innovation. And really giving people confidence through information is the best way to do that. I wanted to touch on two. I'm just going to touch on two myths or two misinformations that are out there that you might need to delve into to support your teams. Again, Resource Pack's going to have this stuff in it for you. So the first one is around EV fires. Oh, EVs catch on fire all the time, don't they? Exactly not the case. About 20 to 60 times less likely to have a fire in an EV than you are in an ICE vehicle. Plenty of research on that. But more importantly is how to deal with the risks and how to deal with the mitigations and in the event of an incident. I can only draw you to the national and world best place for that is EV Fire Safe. Go and see EV Fire Safe. The pack that I'm going to provide you has a bunch of information about it, a bunch of resources. There's a training program which is so cheap it's silly, and they could give you all the information your council's going to need about charging and vehicle related fire risk and mitigation. And the other one we hear all the time is batteries die and go to landfill. They don't die and go to hell, they die and go to landfill. And so there's a bit of a way to consider about this. The answer is it's not true. Batteries do degrade over time, and typically in vehicles we consider 70% of the original battery's state of health to be the time when it's time to come out of the vehicle and potentially be replaced. But most batteries in the future and are already starting to be redeployed for storage. This little battery is being shown as energy storage. Put it in your house, put it in your building, put it at your council, and you'll be able to have it provide firming and storage for renewables into the future. This is going to be a major place for any vehicles, batteries that die. And then once they drop up to below about 50% state of health, that's where they go into recycling. And, they're going to be too valuable to go to landfill. We are seeing 500,000 Ks plus out of vehicles. The plus is a serving suggestion, 700, 800, 900,000, 1 million kilometers out of vehicles' batteries with degradation above the 70% mark. Batteries are going to be valuable for years, and when they're recycled, 95% of the metals are recovered today, and that's only going to get better. So these kinds of issues, which are sometimes barriers through misinformation, poor information, or just a lack of awareness, are something that you can make the most of. Which brings me to final questions, and we've been hitting them along the way. So with a bit of luck, we've got most of them along the way. How's that looking, Claudia? We've hit most of the questions. If you've got another question, please feel free to throw it in the chat. We can address it, but I'll go to our final thank you slide. Some details for Claudia and myself on the left-hand side. If you'd like to contact us, please do feel free to. we can help you with either of our specialties. You're going to see following this session a resource pack, which looks like this left-hand side sheet, and a checklist for your plan, which looks like the right-hand side sheet. It's going to use some of the concepts we've spoken of today, and then there's several pages which have checklists to consider for each of the boxes of the flow diagram that we went through today as well. And that should really help you to consider, am I thinking about these things? And then finally, I'd like to thank Photon Mobility for being able to power today's program. And if you would like to go out and experience some electric trucks, Photon Dealer Network is very ready to go and do that with you. And you can find them in your state at the Dealer Network part of the Photon Mobility website. So with that, thank you, Claudia. Thank you, Austin. And thank you, everybody, for joining us here in this webinar. And I hope that there's been some value for you today. Looking forward to you receiving our resources pack, the recording of this session, and hearing how your journey is going. Thank you.